He's a rabbi, social justice advocate, the father of a bisexual daughter, and an ally of LGBTQ people everywhere. Rabbi Elias Lieberman has been rabbi of the Falmouth Jewish Congregation on Cape Cod since 1990. In that time, he's been a steadfast champion of LGBTQ rights, signing on early to support same-sex marriage when it first became law in Massachusetts, and later becoming an outspoken advocate of transgender rights as well. His congregation also served as the host location for meetings of PFLAG Cape Cod for many years. For Rabbi Lieberman, social justice efforts are all in a day's work, and in keeping with Reform Judaism's focus on repairing the world through a commitment to social justice, a concept referred to as Tee Koon lahm. As he tells PFLAG's Rick Koonce in this interview, the roots of Rabbi Lieberman's commitment to social justice run deep and have been a constant in his life since his boyhood years in Baltimore, when his family gathered for the observance of Shabbat, often welcoming others to their Friday night dinner table. So, Elias, thank you again for being part of this podcast series, Profiles in LGBTQ Courage. I know that you are a strong ally of the LGBTQ community. You're also a rabbi and a social justice advocate. I'm curious as we start here to get a sense of what you would like the listeners to this podcast take away about you and about your work on behalf of the LGBTQ community.
Rick, I am happy to have this conversation with you, and it's a great question. I suppose I would hope that listeners would come away with an understanding of what leads anyone to become an ally, to become an advocate. I would hope also that some would come away understanding that what I've chosen to do and the causes that I've chosen to work on behalf of have a great deal to do with the profession that I chose for myself. As a clergy person, it's very much connected to what I'm doing.
You know, I know that as the leader of the Falmouth Jewish Congregation, your congregation holds very close and very dear this notion of tikkun olam, of repairing the world through a commitment to social justice. Can you talk a little bit about how that religious tradition and mandate inform your engagement as an ally?
Sure. The concept of an obligation to engage in the repair of the world is pretty deeply rooted in Judaism, although its original context is in a mystical context. And it's only really in the past couple of centuries that phrase tikkun olam, Hebrew words which mean repairing the world, have come to be a mandate for engagement with the world. And this is particularly true of the denomination within Judaism that I grew up in and which I was ordained in, and that's called Reform Judaism. And reform is a verb, meaning that it's a constant activity. And the Reform movement historically committed itself to engage with everything we need to do in this world to make it increasingly a better, more humane place. So I took that seriously from an early age, and it has remained an important touchstone for me. There's a really important teaching deep in Jewish tradition. And in translation, it says, you're not obligated to finish the work, but neither are you free to sit back and not engage with the work. And, that really is as good a mantra as I can think of for social justice commitment.
You know, we're living in such a fraught time right now where left and right, if you will, people are being marginalized as the other. And it strikes me that LGBTQ persons, certainly among others, have many challenges that they face societally. Your congregation and your work, you were I think you were the first sponsor of PFLAG programs on the Cape, were you not?
It was very early on, Rick. I would say, I arrived in Falmouth in 1990. And shortly thereafter, although I'm hard-pressed to remember exactly what year it was, I was approached by a member of the LGBTQ community who had asked their clergy person in their church whether their church might host a PFLAG meeting. Apparently, the reaction was not positive, and that person turned to me. I took that request to our congregation's board of directors, and they were quite on board with our welcoming then. So PFLAG met for a number of years here on the Upper Cape, that part of Cape Cod, and we were happy to host them.
Within the Reform tradition, I'm curious, and sort of as the result of your own decades of experience as a rabbi, how do you see God in the LGBTQ community, and what are LGBTQ people a manifestation of? Can you talk a little bit about that?
To do so, I have to engage in that time-honored tradition of coming out. Rick, I am as close as a rabbi who hopes to stay employed can be to being an atheist, which is to say I'm really quite comfortable with saying that my understanding of God is a very non-traditional one. I would sum it up by saying that for me, God is mystery with a capital M, and I pretty much leave it at that. Which is not to say that I'm not informed by teachings in religious traditions about what God might be understood to be. And certainly a fundamental teaching both in Judaism and Christianity is that every human being is created somehow, some way, in the image of God. And I suppose that when I reflect on that phrase, the image of God, it suggests to me every human capability for goodness, for empowerment, for compassion. And therefore, we have to regard every other person as having those same qualities and those same potentials, even when it's hard to see.
It's interesting. As a gay person myself, I've always been fascinated by the variety of human sexuality that exists in our world, and I've always thought that God likes biodiversity in this respect. Fair to say?
I think it is certainly fair to say. I endorse that completely.
Why do you think it is that in this day and age, some people are so hung up or troubled with the notion of any kind of alternative sexuality?
Oh, I think there are different pieces to that answer. I think certainly those of us who would define ourselves as being part of Western civilization have inherited some very problematic messages from our sacred scriptures. And I'll be quite clear, from the Bible, from the Quran, which really depict sexuality as an absolute binary with limits and restrictions of all kinds. And I think that's a very fundamental problem. I think there are many people who simply are not sufficiently in touch with their own gender identities, their own sexual orientations, and therefore are threatened by the possibility that others might be more comfortable in their own skin, in their own bodies with respect to gender and sexuality.
Hmm. I know that, of course, you've been a rabbi on the Cape for many years. I presume you counsel LGBTQ people.
I do from time to time, certainly.
What have you found to be their greatest concerns when they come to you, and what have you found to be an effective way to counsel them?
Well, to be quite honest, I would say, reflecting back on the 30 years that I've been here, I'm hard pressed to say that someone came to me with a concern about self-identifying as gay or lesbian or bisexual. What I have seen a great deal of struggling with, and particularly with respect to families of children who know themselves to be transgender. And that was certainly the arc of my experience with PFLAG over the years. There was a societal shift, I think, greater awareness, and I think a greater acceptance of the reality of LGBT people. I think a much harder challenge for our society has been accepting and understanding the notion of transgender. So on those occasions when I have been asked to speak with people who may have children who are trans, or coming to grips with family members who are coming out to them as transgender, first and foremost, I always say, get yourself to a PFLAG meeting. There are so many important and valuable resources out there which people need to avail themselves of to help them understand, educate themselves, find coping strategies, finding answers to the questions that may be put to them as the family members of someone who is transgender. And not infrequently, I encourage people to pursue therapy in order to deal with their own concerns. And this is generally, I'm speaking generally of family members of people who might be coming out to them.
Yes. Yes. And you, of course, you and your wife have a bisexual daughter. How was the experience of her coming out? How has that informed your ministry since that time in your work on an everyday basis?
I would say that it's been subtle. I probably should back up just a bit. I had a wonderful conversation with our daughter yesterday and asked her to refresh my memory about her coming out experience to us and to her world. Our daughter understood herself to be bisexual probably back by her experiences in junior high school. And in high school, she was a passionate part of the GSA in her high school. She was very active in the wonderful organization formerly known as SIGSIA here on Cape Cod, Cape and Island Gay Straight Youth Alliance, which subsequently came to be named Thrive. And she was very active in that. And I think for the most part, she saw herself as a straight ally in that group. I don't think that she had fully come to self-identify as bisexual. But certainly by the time she went off to college, her first year of college, she was quite comfortable with doing that. I guess it was Thanksgiving of that first year of college for her when she called me and my wife and said, coming home for Thanksgiving and I'm bringing a woman with me. We're in a relationship. And she was so confident that we would have no issue with that, that for her it really was a non-issue, which of course it was the case for me and my wife. I think our daughter had heard enough messages, had seen the degree to which both my wife and I have been supportive allies of the LGBTQ community through the years, to know that she could show herself to us as she is, as she knew herself to be, without any fear of being rejected or criticized or made to feel awkward in any way.
How do you feel, Elias, when you hear of young people who are LGBTQ, who are put out on the street by parents, or who are really told by their parents, "You're dead to me"? How does that make you feel when you hear those news stories?
Rick, it's always heartbreaking. And part of me is disbelieving, although, of course, I understand that this is the reality for far too many young people. You and I both know the statistics about homeless youth. Great many of them are kids on the LGBTQ spectrum who have been cast out, left to fend on their own. One of the gifts that our daughter has given us is enabling us to get to know some of her transgender friends, some of whom she has known for years and is just a devoted friend to. And by extension, we've had opportunities to get to know these people for who they are. And hearing some of their challenging stories about their own families and their own struggles to find a way to be in this world has certainly informed me. It's educated me. I certainly think it's made me more sensitive as a clergy person and prepared to help people within my community who may be challenged by issues of sexuality or gender identity, as well as helping me be a better ally in the broader community.
What do you think are the biggest misconceptions about transgender people?
Oh, all those stereotypes about they're not really male, they're not really female, it's just a phase, particularly when they're talking about younger people. They are looking for what advantages, minority rights, et cetera, all of the terrible misunderstandings that are applied to them because people simply don't want to find ways to understand the phenomenon, to get to know people for who they are. And I think, of course, one of the larger issues is, I think, a fundamental lack of understanding of sexuality and gender identity as existing on a continuum. I think there's such an attitude of looking at the world through binary eyes that people feel or suspect that people with different experiences just are not being honest or true.
Yes. I'm taken. I am not Jewish myself. I have many Jewish friends, and I'm struck by the fact that within the Jewish tradition, there is such a focus on community. And I'm wondering how that focus on community, the notion of surviving, of thriving, kind of curious to hear how your own spiritual background and experience uniquely inform how you counsel LGBTQ people.
Rick, I think that probably really have to go back to my childhood, and I think about messages that I absorbed from my parents and observing my parents and their social circles, etc. I have a very distinct memory. Part of my childhood experience in a Jewish family was observing Friday evening, welcoming the Sabbath. We always had a family meal. Even if my older brothers and I had plans to go out and be with friends later that Friday evening, we were always expected to be at the Shabbat dinner table. And that was a very important and beautiful piece of my childhood. And another part of that was my parents always welcoming guests to our Shabbat table. And one guest in particular was an Episcopal priest in Baltimore, where I grew up, who my mom had befriended through their mutual involvement with Planned Parenthood. My mom worked for Planned Parenthood as a sex educator for a number of years. And this particular Episcopal priest was involved with some of that work. And somehow I don't really know whether I was explicitly told this or whether I inferred it, but it became clear to me, perhaps in retrospect, that this particular Episcopal priest was also a gay man. And reflecting back on that, once I came to that knowledge, it spoke volumes to me about who my parents were. That clearly they were folks who had no issues, no prejudice, certainly with respect to gay or lesbian people, to the extent that they were welcome guests at our Shabbat table. And I like to think of that particular incident as perhaps being the seed which put me on a path of understanding and acceptance. And I really credit my parents and thank them for that experience.
It's a lovely story. And so you got the modeling for inclusivity very early. And what's your advice to parents? And maybe you've offered this advice or perspective in PFLAG meetings here on the Cape. Your advice, your counsel to families, to parents who are struggling to accept their child as LGBTQ. What do you normally say to them?
So much depends on the particular individuals, the particular family. I think sometimes a piece of what I would share would be to really encourage them to think long and hard about how they came to an understanding of who they are. That is to say, really to ask them quite plainly, can you remember a point in your life when you decided to be a heterosexual? When you decided that you were going to be sexually attracted to someone of the opposite gender? I think that parents, even when they feel they know their children and love them deeply, are just sometimes operating under misunderstandings of some very basic realities about sexuality, about gender identity. There's often, I think, a desire to say, well, my child is choosing this or is willfully doing this in opposition to my desires or our faith tradition or whatever it might be. And I think if you can move them just a little bit and ask them to ask themselves those questions and suggest to them that their child is coming to an understanding of him or herself as a human being in ways that you never stopped to, you were never required to, because you fit a societal model which was somehow more acceptable.
It's, as we talk here, I know that your advocacy and alliance with the LGBTQ community is of long standing. And I know that back when same-sex marriage was being debated in Massachusetts, you wrote quite forcefully in support of it. And what is your message to people who are LGBTQ plus? What's your message to them about something traditional, a traditional form of connection like marriage? What's your message to them about its applicability to them?
I think really it's not inherently different than I would put it to any couple. That is to say, there are ways to make sacred a relationship, and they can happen in many different ways, simply by the commitments that we make one to another and the ways that we choose to live our lives as a couple. Sometimes they can involve ritual, because ritual can be a marvelous tool to enhance, to lift up, to take out of the realm of the mundane and to move a relationship into a realm which in Hebrew we call kadosh. It's really a word which translates as sacred. And some of those rituals, some of those tools involve institutions or time-honored rituals such as marriage. So I think I would really just say it's one of many ways that people can opt to say something about the nature of their commitment to each other, about what they want that relationship to reflect into the world. And for some people, it makes all the sense in the world. For others, it's simply unnecessary. And I have great respect for people who choose either path.
Yeah, it's really about having a big tent and embracing all. And as we talk here, I'm just struck by the nature of your being an ally to the community. And what's your call to other people in terms of taking up the mantleship of being an ally? What do you encourage others to do in this regard?
I encourage them to look for and take advantage of whatever opportunities come their way. And it can be as small but as important as being present when a joke is made or an offhand negative comment about somebody who is LGBTQ or any other minority, and saying, it really makes me uncomfortable to hear that. I have dear friends who are part of that community. I have a child who is. It's hurtful to me to hear that kind of remark. Not everyone is brave enough to do that, but I think it's a small but really an important example of ways that you can manifest allyship in a significant act. From there, it ripples outwards. It's the letters that we might be prepared to send to the Cape Cod Times. It's the conversation that we have with our neighbor when something comes up. What we do with our money. I don't want to minimize the impact of the decisions we make about what to do with our discretionary funds. You can be a great ally with a checkbook, even if you never step foot at a rally.
Mm. I'm struck here as we talk that you come out of a deep religious tradition. What is your counsel and what are your thoughts about people who are LGBTQ who have really been abused by the church, by their religious denomination? How do you counsel them when in fact they may be pursuing the coming out process with a lot of anger around organized religion?
The reality is, Rick, that I rarely have conversations with those people because, as you say, sometimes there is such anger, such resentment at the religious institutions which they feel rejected them or diminished their personhood, that they don't seek out a clergy person to have that conversation. I think one of the more important things that I can do, and certainly is part of what I see myself doing as an ally, is being very clear that I'm standing in this position as a clergy person, that I am a rabbi. I don't represent all rabbis. I don't speak for all rabbis, but I am, by my professional choice, a rabbi who is very clear about these issues, who is very clear that the version of Judaism that I represent, that I cherish, is inclusive, that recognizes the divinity of all people, and that many things in my tradition, I think, simply are unequivocally wrong. So when I read in scripture, it's prohibition in Leviticus about sexual activity between men. I just think that's a reflection of something my ancestors got tremendously wrong, and therefore of no longer relevant in 2020.
Yes. Is that the respect in which at times you feel like an atheist?
Well, it's times when I feel estranged from the more traditional parts of my community, but I absolutely endorse the belief that Judaism has evolved over the past several thousand years, as all religions do and should. I feel fortunate that I was raised in an expression of Judaism which allows for that flexibility, that allows for new understandings of old traditions and old pronouncements.
Well, and to that point and in that spirit, I'm taken with something you wrote in 2018 in the Cape Cod Times. It was a piece, "The Jewish Case for Supporting Transgender Rights," and you spoke about the scriptural passage which you mentioned earlier about being made in God's image, humankind being made in God's image. And then you told this wonderful story about the two rabbis being approached by a man who wanted to convert. And can you tell that story and apply it to what people of any faith might reasonably do to be accepting and hospitable to others unlike themselves?
Absolutely. The story is attributed to two first-century rabbis, Rabbi Hillel and his contemporary Rabbi Shammai. Both had schools, as it were. They had disciples. On some issues of Jewish law, they agreed. On others, they disagreed. And according to this legend, which is preserved in the Talmud, a pagan, a non-Jew, a non-Christian, came to Rabbi Shammai and rather impertinently said, "Will you teach me all of the Torah while standing on one foot?" And Rabbi Shammai, who happened to be holding his walking stick, beat the person around the head and said, "Get lost. That's an impertinent question. Be gone." According to the story, the same individual then approached Rabbi Hillel and said, "Please teach me all of Torah while standing on one foot." And it's possible that he said it contemptuously, as if to say, I have no respect for this tradition. You should be able to teach it to me while you stand on one foot. Rabbi Hillel responded quite differently than Rabbi Shammai, and he said, "What's hateful to you, don't do to anyone else. That is the whole Torah. Go and learn it." So the essence of his response is, it is perfectly appropriate to expect that others will treat you in a way that you deserve to be treated. Don't treat them the way you don't wish to be treated. But he went one step further. He said, go and learn it, go and study. If you have a fundamental lack of understanding of what it means to be a gay person, a lesbian, a bisexual, or transgender, you have an obligation to educate yourself, to learn enough to understand their reality. And then you're in a much better position to know how to relate to them.
Beautifully said. And well, as we wind up, Elias, I'm kind of curious. Is there anything I have not asked you about today that you think is pertinent to this conversation that I haven't asked you directly about, but which has bubbled up for you as we've talked?
Great question. I feel like I should be able to close with a joke. I think that humor really is a sacred tool among many others. And I frequently turn to storytelling when I conduct wedding ceremonies, occasionally at funerals. So I'm sorry, Rick, I don't have a joke at hand, but I would certainly say that I tend to think of myself as somebody who appreciates humor and feels that it has a valuable role in our spiritual lives.
It helps to leaven the loaf, doesn't it?
It does indeed.
And I'm just kind of curious as we wrap up, if people want more information about your work and involvements as an ally to the LGBTQ community, or if they want to know more about your ministry there in the congregation, what would you like to offer in the way of ways they can be in touch with you?
I would welcome any outreach. They can reach me by going to our website, which can be found at www.falmouthjewish.org. Falmouth Jewish is one word, falmouthjewish.org. And on that website, you can find a contact button, and that email will reach me. We also have a Facebook page, Falmouth Jewish Congregation.
Elias, thank you so much for your time today. I think this will be a great resource to people who listen to this podcast. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure, Rick. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.